Japanese monster, awakening once again? Holding the dominant position in Asia for nearly 80 years, single-handedly dwarfing China in size by over 10 times, causing the Russian Navy to suffer its most devastating defeat in history. Japan, in the past, was a reckless and arrogant swordsman. However, the traumas from the first and only atomic bombing in history are something the Japanese never want to experience again. They have no desire for their country to engage in any other wars. After World War II, Japan dissolved the Imperial Japanese Army, relinquishing control of the Army, Navy, Air Force, or any other military force. They focused only on developing Japan's self-defense forces with the intended purpose of self-protection. Japan committed to never initiating war or declaring any aggressive actions to resolve international disputes. This action was akin to disarming the twin wings on their back with their own hands. Once a military powerhouse, Japan now resembles a toothless tiger. However, the current situation seems to be urging this beast to awaken once again. While the beast slept after World War II, Japan quickly rebranded itself with an entirely new identity. They concentrated on economic development and rapidly became the world's third-largest economic power, rather than a military powerhouse. Nevertheless, in recent years, Japan has shown a trend of increased military spending. Since December 2022, Japan has announced 3 crucial defense documents, including a modified national security strategy, a defense strategy, and a defense build-up plan within the revised national security strategy. Tokyo aims to enhance Japan's offensive capabilities, a significant shift in post-war security policy. Contrary to its constitution that previously focused on defense, Japan has outlined a plan to increase the defense budget annually to reach 2% of GDP by 2027. This officially places Japan among the top 3 countries with the largest defense expenditures globally. This ambitious trajectory seems to be actively underway. In 2022, Japan's defense spending reached 5.4 trillion yen, increased to 6.8 trillion yen in 2023, and is expected to exceed 7 trillion yen in 2024. What led to Japan's policy change, and how does it affect the global political landscape? A slight reversal in history, the Meiji Restoration genuinely gave Japan a new face. Not only a change in appearance, but the mindset of the Japanese also became more open and ambitious. Throughout most of its history, the island nation isolated itself from the rest of the world. It was only by the late 19th century that Japan began a robust period of expansion. The Japanese realized that to preserve their nation's independence, they needed to modernize and become a power equal to Western colonialists. This laid the foundation for Japan to become the first power in Asia and fostered the development of fascist ideas in the country. Japan began to gather intelligence from around the world and embarked on an ambitious program of political, economic, and social reforms. Especially in the military, their army was organized and trained in Western style, with the army following the German model and the navy imitating the British Navy. Weapon factories followed the French model, and logistics systems were largely learned from the United States. Japan also implemented mandatory military service for its army, increased the purchase and production of weapons and ammunition, and invited foreign military instructors to teach. They sent students and officers to countries like England or France for further learning. In just a quarter of a century, Japan succeeded in modernizing itself, to the point where it changed the balance of power in East Asia from China to Japan. They defeated China in the wars of 1894 and 1895, causing significant damage to the prestige of the Qing dynasty and classical traditions in China. The victory marked Japan's rise as a military power. Russia could not believe it, and the world was even more incredulous that an Asian country could effectively apply Western strategic and tactical technology. For the first time, the Russians were helpless in catching up with the military strength of an Asian country. Japan began to have a more significant voice on the international stage, joining the Allies in participating in large and small wars worldwide. Japan quickly expanded its influence in China and seized German assets in the Pacific and East Asia. By the end of World War I, the explosion of the war had diversified the country's industries, turning Japan from a debtor nation into a creditor nation. However, the prosperity brought by World War I did not last. Japan quickly suffered severe consequences due to the economic crisis of 1929 to 1933, as the island nation, poor in resources and industry, struggled to cope with the challenges. Unable to solve the difficulties caused by the shortage of resources, the Japanese had to quickly find a solution, and their chosen solution was to militarize the country, initiating war to conquer territories from other nations to secure their resources. The invasion of China, marked by the Nanking Massacre in 1937, shocked the world as Japan carried out brutal actions to serve its industrial needs. Upon witnessing the barbaric actions of Japan to support its industry, the United States could no longer remain silent. The U.S. condemned Japan's insane actions and imposed economic sanctions, including an embargo on the export of aircraft, oil, and metals, as well as many other essential goods. Alongside providing economic support to the nationalist forces, the U.S. hoped these sanctions would force Japan to cease its aggressive actions. At that time, Japan faced two choices: either reconcile with the U.S. or escalate into war. However, the bloodthirsty sword wielders of that time were frenziedly immersed in the intoxication of war, ready to sacrifice themselves for their cause at any moment. They would not stop, and the confident Japanese were pushing the limits with their military might. They aggressively targeted the resource-rich territories in the Southeast Asian peninsula, challenging the constraints imposed by the United States. The U.S. swiftly relocated military bases in the Pacific from San Francisco to Tran Chau Port to establish a blockade and control over Japan. The Japanese found themselves inevitably heading towards a war with the Americans. To protect their position and the honor of a major world power, issues could not be resolved through diplomatic negotiations alone. The Japanese, however, never thought that their strategic moves were not only digging their own grave but also awakening a sleeping giant. The attack on Pearl Harbor prompted the United States to enter World War II and confront the fascist powers, including Japan. The United States, akin to a sleeping giant, would unleash a terrible fate upon anyone daring to disturb its slumber. Japan's fate had been sealed since they dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor in 1945. The devastation caused by the two atomic bombs forced Japan to unconditional surrender to the United States and its allies. From being a mighty empire, Japan now faced the American occupation. The U.S. aimed to control Japan by putting a metaphorical leash around its neck. The Americans understood better than anyone that Japanese fascism had a much longer historical origin than that of Italy and Germany. As early as the 9th century, samurai warriors held ruling power in Japan. The code of the samurai became the moral code of the Japanese people, emphasizing courage, extreme self-respect, and unwavering loyalty. Nowhere else in the world did a tradition exist where one could willingly end their own life to preserve honor, as in Japan. The relentless pursuit of perfection would turn a caterpillar into a butterfly that couldn't fly unless its wings were broken. One of the most effective ways to control Japan was to disband its military. The spirit of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was indeed a rare value among the Japanese. These were the products in the Bushido collection, such as necklaces and rings made of silver, carrying messages about true warriors who mastered their lives with unwavering spirit to overcome challenges and adversities, creating a meaningful existence. The Japanese Constitution of 1947 had only one clear amendment. The Japanese people would permanently renounce war as a sovereign right. They would never use force or the threat of force to settle international disputes. To ensure the enforcement of this provision, the Japanese land, sea, and air forces, as well as any potential for war, would not be recognized. The nation's right to wage war would not be acknowledged. The U.S. closed its military bases on this archipelago with the promise to protect Japan from any aggression. Japan knew that to preserve its homeland, it needed U.S. assistance. Moreover, the traumas of World War II had truly humbled Japan spiritually. They agreed to let the Americans put a metaphorical leash on them, allowing the U.S. military to be stationed in Japan. Acting against foreign oppression, the U.S. was allowed to intervene in East Asia to maintain peace without interfering in Japan's internal politics. Since then, the Japanese focused on economic development under the protective umbrella of the U.S., temporarily forgetting the aggressive imperial blood running through their veins. They were just waiting for the right moment. A moment to awaken once again. The Americans had a longer-term perspective than anyone else. What they wanted in Japan was not just obedience, it was a firm foothold for the US to compete for influence in the Asian region, especially in the face of the rising giants, Russia and China, and the historical backdrop of the US-Soviet relations during the Cold War, which divided the world into two opposing camps since 1948. North Korea, backed by Stalin, was established, and the People's Republic of China followed a year later. The spread of new communism was a potential threat to US influence in the future. Imperial Japan, which once dominated the globe, was now completely under US control. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. The US deployed forces stationed in Japan to the Korean peninsula to aid South Korea. If any force attacked Japan at that moment, the US might not have been able to respond adequately. They began to realize their serious mistake in disbanding the Japanese military. The US started encouraging Japan to establish a military force. In 1954, the Japan Self-Defense Forces (JSDF) were born, consisting of the ground, maritime, and air self-defense forces. However, they were strictly bound by the pacifist constitution, with the primary mission of defending the country and not participating in any wars worldwide. Despite this limitation, Japan invested heavily in modern equipment comparable to any military force in other countries. Japan remained among the top 10 countries spending the most on defense, as mentioned earlier. However, compared to many other powers, the amount Japan spent was relatively modest. If only for self-defense, it was sufficient, but look at the map, Japan was defending against whom? In recent years, North Korea, China, and Russia had been constant headaches for the Japanese. The closest adversaries to Tokyo possessed nuclear weapons that Japan did not want to experience again. North Korea, though not economically strong, had the capability to surprise Japan with weapons tests and missile launches into the waters around Japan. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine in recent years showed that a distant country could not save its close neighbor from a crisis. Moreover, history would make China and Russia never forget their animosities, even those from the previous century. Japan had territorial disputes with both of these giants. Japan and Russia had long-standing conflicts over the Kuril Islands, similar to China. They would never forgive Japan if the Diaoyu Islands fell into Japanese hands. If a worst-case scenario occurred, the current Japanese self-defense forces might not be able to withstand the power of these two giants. It seemed ironic, an army that once overwhelmed the world now lacked the capability to defend against any neighboring country's attack. This reality prompted Japan to protect itself and not solely rely on the US against increasing threats from its neighbors. Japan had ambitions to become a military power in recent years. They spent more aggressively on the defense budget, despite being constrained by the pacifist constitution. However, Japan still possessed the ability to compete successfully in the global arms market due to its world-leading scientific and technological expertise. Japan had over 1,000 companies capable of producing more than 90% of the equipment supplied to the Japanese self-defense forces. These companies included major domestic players such as Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, Shindaiwa, Iseka, Wajima, and Hajime. Particularly in shipbuilding, the Japanese Navy could construct all types of modern warships, from light to heavy class. They had achieved notable successes, and Tokyo could even build aircraft carriers with fighter jets or helicopters, amphibious assault ships, anti-aircraft combat destroyers, modern submarines, air-independent propulsion systems, missile defense vessels, or patrol boats. Japan's domestically manufactured ships were highly rated and belonged to the world's advanced forefront. Moreover, many newspapers pointed out that Japan had the capacity to manufacture up to 2,000 nuclear bombs. The number 2,000 might not be in. With the most devastating weapons of all time capable of producing 2,000 or more nuclear bombs within reach, Japan has the potential to do so. This assertion is primarily based on the abundant nuclear bomb manufacturing fuel resources of the country, with two types of materials used for making atomic bombs: plutonium Pu-239 and uranium U-235. Regarding the fuel or fissionable material Pu-239, it is a byproduct in the process of burning uranium fuel rods in the reactor. Japan has undoubtedly accumulated a substantial amount over 3 to 4 decades of operating its civilian nuclear industry. They have gained extensive experience in separating plutonium from the burned fuel rods for many years. Japan has constructed a comprehensive facility for fuel rod processing in the northern part of the country. Additionally, from 1999 to the present, the separation and enrichment of plutonium have been processed in France and the UK. According to Japan's announcement to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the country currently possesses a significant asset with approximately 44.3 tons of plutonium. Among this, 35 tons are held in France and the UK, while the remaining 9.3 tons are stored in Japan. If upgraded to weapons grade with about 90% Pu-239 enrichment, it could manufacture a nuclear bomb with around 6 to 9 kilograms of plutonium. Even with advanced technology, using 1 to 3 kilograms of plutonium, a nuclear-like explosion could be achieved. Therefore, a rough calculation based on these figures indicates that the number of 2,000 atomic bombs is a realistic possibility, and Japan's nuclear ambitions are not far-fetched. Certainly, the production of such high-level intellectual weapons requires various complex technologies. However, for a highly developed industrial nation like Japan, these factors may not be significant obstacles. For instance, in terms of software proficiency and supercomputing tools to solve nuclear bomb design problems. Everyone is aware that Japan currently possesses a supercomputer with a computing speed of hundreds of billions of calculations per second. Therefore, they have the capability to conduct simulations of a nuclear explosion. The means to transport nuclear warheads is also an interesting concern. In reality, Japan began researching missile development in February 1970, launching the 24 kilograms Osumi satellite into space. Japan became the fourth country to use its own launch vehicle for satellite deployment. Since then, with over 10 types of made-in-Japan missiles, they have launched more than 50 satellites into various orbits, becoming a major player in space research. Japan has achieved outstanding success in the technology of manufacturing high-temperature resistant materials, precision guidance equipment, and precise impact point control. This includes anti-jamming devices for small, medium, and intercontinental ballistic missile warheads. Therefore, it is not an exaggeration when Professor James Holmes, a researcher at the U.S. Naval War College, wrote that if the Japanese public and leaders unanimously decide to possess nuclear weapons, they could immediately become a truly nuclear-armed nation. In the current politically heated situation surrounding Japan, the possibility of Japan reawakening and becoming a military power once again is not far-fetched.